Hello! So today we're going to be talking about how to create some fun vegetables, kind of in an illustrative style. So we're going to talk about how you can create vegetables just using watercolor and adding ink on top of it. And then also, kind of the traditional way, which I do a lot of, where I draw them first, then ink them and do watercolor on top. But what's kind of freeing about doing the watercolor first is you can kind of let the paint go where it wants to, and you can use the ink to kind of get that structure and that shape back into your painting. So, something that looks like just a little blob, it could be a cookie or a potato. So that's what's kind of fun about watercolor, is you can put lots of different colors on there and then use the ink to get the shape again. So I have kind of a little reference sheet of vegetables off to the sides. That's what I would recommend, or you can try and just come up with them from your imagination. That's kind of up to you. So I have like a sheet that has like tomatoes, carrots, cucumbers, all sorts of stuff like that. Or sometimes if you just think of one, you can just paint it. And then I have my palette to the side of me, and I just have all my colors already, ready. I use tubes of watercolor and just put them into my little wells so I can always have them. A good kind of practice is sometimes, if you know you're going to use a lot of different colors, is using a mister or a spray bottle to spray your colors at first, because it'll help you to grab the paint a little bit better. Or sometimes I just do a little dollop of water into each one. So, and the first one we're going to do is some broccoli. And for the broccoli, I'm going to go ahead and prep some colors over here. And the first color I'm going to prep is my lemon yellow, which could be called like cadmium yellow light, something like that. I'm going to put a little bit in here, add water to it. If it looks too light, then I need to add more paint. If I need it lighter, I add more water. And then also I'm going to take again some of that water, put it here, take some lemon yellow, and I'm going to add some sap green. So sap green is kind of a nice base green for a lot of different things. So this sap green has a bit more darker tones to it, because it's a little more toned down with like brown. So if I wanted it to look like a little happier, a cheerful green, I could add just a touch of blue. I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt blue, but ultramarine blue also works. I like cobalt blue because sometimes it's a little bit brighter. And then I'm going to have a little area that's my sap green. And then I'm going to add a lot of blue to make it darker. If it gets too blue, then you can always add more yellow or more green. Like that. So they're nice, rich puddles. You don't want too much water in your puddles, because as we're painting, we're going to be adding more water to our painting. So if this is too wet and that's too wet, it's not really going to have enough color. So what I'm going to do is I'm using my lemon yellow to almost draw with it. And what I mean by draw is not literally like drawing an outline of broccoli and then filling it in. I'm mostly kind of thinking about the shape of my broccoli, kind of like a tree almost. And then the little stalk like that. It could even be cauliflower at this point. I'm going to do another one next to it. And then while it's wet, I'm going to drop in some of that sap green and yellow. And when I drop it in, I don't want to like do polka dots like that. I'm kind of laying the tip of my brush on the side and kind of putting in splotches. And I'm trying to leave a sense of light on one side, so I have more yellow on one side than the other. A little bit over here. And what's nice about this is we're going to add ink on top of it once it's dried. So if you mess up, it's okay. It's just fun. And I'm going to take my darker green and drop a little more on the side. It may have to go a little darker, so I may add maybe some Payne's gray to it, or just more paint, less water. And sometimes if I notice that, you know, maybe I'm losing all my colors, I can drop yellow back into it, and then I'm just gonna leave it, not touch it, let it dry. So, and then you can see that's what I did with this one over here, but I didn't add ink yet to this one. I did add ink to this one. So, but we'll talk about that later. Next, I'm gonna make some cucumber. Of course, with these, they almost look like squash sometimes, or really weird shaped watermelon. This is also how I'd make a watermelon. But I'm gonna use that same yellow again, and I'm starting from the back of the cucumber and going forward to kind of try and get the shape. You know, if I was doing a squash, then I would probably make it like bigger on the bottom. But we're trying to make cucumber. And then while that's wet, and you don't want it sopping wet. So if I kind of like turn my paper and notice there's like a big puddle on top, that means I have too much water and I need to let it sit for a second before I start adding in my green. And then what I'm gonna do is just streak in green and kind of skip a little area to make like those little lines in the cucumber, or squash. And I'll do it on this one. This is gonna be a squash of some sort. So this one was not as wet, so I'm not getting that fun texture, but I can always add my darker green on top to get more shape to it. So now I'm gonna use my darker green, and I'm gonna mainly put it on like the bottom and just leave it. That's the hard part about watercolor, is the prettiness is sometimes just the weird blossoms you get and just letting it sit there. And I could do like a little slice of cucumber by doing a little yellow circle. And again, you know, if I notice that it's really puddly, I may want to tap off my brush a bit, maybe make a second one so that this one has time to dry. Then I'll use my dark green and do a little outline. This time I'm actually using the tip of my brush. Like that, and see how it gets a little fuzzy, which is what we want. And I'll do some little dots for like texture, almost like the seeds in there, but not really. And I can use water if it's not wet enough. And that kind of creates all these fun little blossoms in there. You know, and if it's too wet, that's how you get this right here, where the water has pushed the pigment too far away, versus this one was a little less wet. So I got a better ridge right there. So, and you don't have to do two and just stop. You could always keep practicing that same technique over and over again, because you know, with watercolor, it's very technique based and takes a lot of repetition. So another one we're gonna do is I'm gonna take my cadmium red. So cadmium red is kind of like a fire trucky, you know, it's a warm red, looks kind of like either of these. You may have a color called vermilion, or I'm trying to think what other brands have different names, but you know, it's gonna look like a warm red. A pinky red is gonna be more like a scarlet or a alizarin crimson, and we're gonna use probably some of that for like the shadow. But I'm starting with my red, that cadmium red. And I'm gonna be making a tomato. So, depending how the tomato goes, it may look more like a cherry, and that's fine. You can just give it a stem and call it a cherry. But we're going for not like a perfectly round circle to make it feel like a tomato. Tomatoes are pretty round, but they tend to have like a little bump right there. And then we're gonna try and leave a little curved highlight on our tomato, like that. And while it's wet, I can take more of that same red, but with less water, to put a little shadow on one side. Or my alizarin crimson. You know, and you have to think about, with red, what colors are gonna get along with red. Like blue, if I add a little blue, it may just be like a little bit of a purple shadow. If I add green, it's gonna turn into a brown shadow, since red and green are complementary across the color wheel. So sometimes purple is a good one because it won't like ruin your red. See, it'll still look pretty warm. So we're gonna leave that. And I'll paint another one. You could do some perfectly round, maybe they're like those little grape tomatoes. Like that. And the important part is trying to have as little brush strokes as possible. So I'm starting kind of with an outline and then I'm kind of overlapping my brush strokes like this, so then I get rid of as much of my brush strokes as possible, and then it looks pretty smooth. Because if I use like the very tip of my brush, you know, it's going to have a lot of lines versus using the side of the tip, I get kind of a nice flat wash. And you can do like an open tomato where you do it kind of the same way, but you're really just doing like the outline of the tomato. Looks kind of like an apple. And then using a little water to fuzz the edges. And then once it's dry, I also added a little yellow on these, but you can add inking on top and it makes it actually look like a tomato. Right now it's just, you know, could be anything. It's like an apple. And I would probably wait for it to dry, but you could also go in later and do the little stem on the tomato. I don't think grape tomatoes have a stem. They have like a little thing. I'm not sure. And then for like a potato. Now potatoes are very fun. So potatoes, you know, you have like the golden potatoes, the russet potatoes. There's not a limit to how many potatoes you could do. I'm going to take some yellow ochre with a lot of water to make a really nice cream color. And I could always take a little bit of burnt umber or Van Dyke brown. It's kind of a nice dark like that. See, it makes it just a tiny bit darker. And what I'm going to do, so this is for like a golden potato, but if it gets too dark, then it's a russet potato. And potatoes are pretty round. They're a little eggy shaped. So I'm just doing like a little golden shape. And while it's wet, I'm just going to tap in a little bit of brown. And that gives it a little bit of texture. You know, could be a cookie, could be a potato. I could do another little potato like that. Or I could just do a little shadow at the bottom of the potato. But for like a sweet potato, now sweet potatoes, they're a little bit more reddish in color. So a great color to make that is like your burnt umber and a bit of alizarin crimson. So I'm going to take, this is dry. I can't get it off. So that's why I'm painting on top of it. It's not really there. So I'm going to take some burnt umber, which depending on your color, you know, your colors may be a little different than mine. Sometimes it'll say burnt umber, but it'll look vastly different from someone else's burnt umber. So you kind of have to adjust from there. So like this one's very orange. So when I add the red, if it looked a little, you know, too sunburnt, then I may have to come in with a little bit of blue to tone it down like that. So just a smidge of burnt umber and alizarin crimson. And then sweet potatoes are kind of gnarly and rooty looking, so they don't have to be perfectly round. They can have those little roots on them. And then while it's wet, I can drop in more of my alizarin crimson and then some burnt umber on the bottom of my potato. So, and then you kind of have a sweet potato. So, and the difference between this paper and this paper is this is actually Arch's cold press paper versus this is some Canson paper. So it's going to react a little bit differently. I can do more layers when I'm on the Arch's paper, but this paper is still kind of fun to work on. So, and I'm just gonna let that dry. You know, you can always come back and do new layers, like maybe it got too flat. I can let it dry and try and put back some more dark, but you don't wanna overpaint it because then that's how it just becomes flat in one color. So then let's say we're gonna do carrots. So for my carrots, you know, we're kind of keeping them simple. We're not going for photorealism. These are kind of just cute little, you know, 5-minute carrots. I want to make a yellowy orange and then a kind of darker orange for a bit of a shadow. So when you're making oranges, red is a bit more of a dominant color than yellow is. So I want to start with my yellow. I'm just going to use my lemon yellow because I have a lot of that yellow. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of red to it. If you have an orange, you could use that, but I have the colors. So I'm making a yellowy orange. And these are like those nice like stew carrots. So they're going to be nice and long, a little fatter at the top, get a little skinny at the bottom. And then just like the tomatoes, I'm going to try and leave a little highlight. Oops, I got a little fat down here, so I'm going to make it a little skinnier. And then I'll add a touch more red to my orange. And while it's wet, put a little on one side. Like that, just to keep it simple, little carrot. I can make a really orange carrot on this one. I'm kind of like drawing the top. Adding more red. Like that. You could even do baby carrots, which they're just like little blobs. There you go, baby carrots. And of course, I would let this dry before I did like the top leaves on the carrot. But let's pretend this one's kind of dry. I could just do like some fun little blobs. I'm just barely touching my paper. And to make it look even looser, then I also take a darker color and drop it in also. Kind of making the hair of your carrot. And then I could use the same color I used for my sweet potato to make like some radishes. Radishes are kind of fun. They look almost like little balloons. So those are like fun. They look like little mice. So again, you want to make sure you wait for things to dry before you do other things. So, and then let's say I was going to do inking first, because I'm going to let these dry for a moment before I add inking to those. So you could draw out your vegetables directly onto your watercolor paper, or you could draw them separately and then transfer them. I even, if I'm doing like a really loose exercise, I like to just draw with an ink pen onto my watercolor paper because then I can't erase and I have to keep it a little more gestural. So like for my carrots, I'm just going to draw like the top of my carrots. That. Then I'm going to draw a little greenery. I could literally draw a highlight on here if I wanted to. Or like a tomato. I could try and be really loosey-goosey. Or broccoli. So that's just for quick little things. So if you do the inking beforehand, what you kind of decide is if you want to follow exactly where your inking went or go a little bit outside of it. So like I could just go and make it a little loose. I'm trying to go around the highlight still, but just adding some colors. making it darker in some areas. Not being afraid for things to blend together, which can be kind of tricky because we always want things to be perfect sometimes. So that's something to think about because your ink is waterproof. So you can kind of have fun with it because your inking will still stay there even when you put, color everywhere. Or even when you're inking, you can only go inside if you want to have some little white highlights that are just like the white of the paper. So, but if I'm inking my watercolors that are now dry, just make sure they're dry because that can hurt your ink pen. It can, drag through the paper. You might end up with like a hole in your paper. But when you're using ink on top of a watercolor, you can decide sometimes if you want to go exactly along the lines, make it like really rigid, following it as close as possible. Or sometimes, like especially if I mess up and maybe I got a little outside the lines, I can just make my line a little thicker and that will hide it because all you see is the ink line. You don't see the little, fuzzy edges. Or I could even, do half of an outline. I don't have to outline the whole thing. Maybe just do some little lines. And you can also use the inking for shading. So like this little grape tomato, I could make the sense of a little shadow on this side just by doing some curved hatching. This one I could add little seeds. Kind of like a tomato. And then my broccoli, again, I can kind of go outside of my lines to add more texture to my broccoli. I could do long hatching. You can even use it to separate things, like maybe I had parts of my broccoli that blended in, or I want to add just little bits of texture. You can even add like lines for detail on like your carrots, or even add little roots at the bottom with the inking. So just have fun. Don't worry about messing up. If you love it, you can turn it into a recipe card. You could chop it up, turn them into mini little greeting cards like happy spring. But happy painting.